Hi everyone, I'm Anna, 52, and I think I've lived a lot longer than most people. I moved to this quiet coastal town in an attempt to escape the chaos of my previous life because the house I shared with John, my husband of 28 years, had become empty and hollow after his cancer slowly robbed him of his vitality bit by bit. Now, in this little bookstore by the sea, I saw peace, something I hadn't felt in years. The bookstore became my sanctuary, a place to drown out the loneliness that occasionally felt like it would swallow me. It was small, but that was just right for me. The shelves were full of used books, and the air smelled strongly of paper and ink. I didn't need much more than the usual routine of opening and closing and killing time while reading stories that other people had written. The customers came in strips, mostly locals who knew the town well and a few tourists. That's how I met Daniel, a young man who was the son of the couple who lived in the cottage next to mine. He had recently returned from the city to assist his parents. Before he started staying longer to help out around the shop, cleaning shelves and carrying heavy boxes of new arrivals, Daniel was just a friendly face and a reminder that the world wasn't entirely closed off. He would stop by to pick up a book or two and we would talk casually about the weather or the books he was interested in. I found myself looking forward to his visits more than I cared to admit because Daniel had a way of bringing warmth with him, a kind of energy that filled. I was 52 and he couldn't have been older than 30, so it felt ridiculous at first when I felt that flicker of attraction. It had been years since I thought of myself as anything other than John's widow, but Daniel was always there, his presence becoming more familiar every day until it was strange when he wasn't around. One evening, as we were closing up the bookstore together, there was a moment that was nothing special, just the same. His smile was contagious, and he laughed easily, something that had been missing from my life for too long. We were standing at the counter discussing the newest collection of books when I gave him a novel to put on the shelf. As our fingers touched, I felt a shock of electricity, but he didn't pull away, and our eyes met, and the air between us felt charged in a way I hadn't expected. "I must tell you something," Daniel said, his voice lower and more serious than usual. I tried to maintain a neutral expression, but my heart was already racing. He moved closer until I could smell the faint. He whispered, "I didn't just come back here for my parents," adding, "I've been wanting to spend more time with you, and it's not just about the books or helping out, it's you." In that dim bookstore, the world seemed to narrow to just the two of us, and I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing at all. His eyes were fixed on mine, looking for some indication that I felt it too, and the truth was that I did, but I couldn't let myself admit it just yet. He leaned in so slowly that I could have stopped him at any time, but I didn't, and when his lips finally touched mine, everything seemed to stop. It was tender at first, as if he were pushing the limits of what was acceptable, but as the kiss grew deeper and all the years of loneliness vanished, I could feel myself slipping into what felt like a lifetime desire. When we parted ways, there was no turning back. We both knew that the line had been crossed, and Daniel began to look uncertain. "I don't want to push you into anything." Despite the guilt that tugged at the edges of my conscience for moving on and wanting something for myself again, I couldn't deny what was happening between Daniel and me over the next few weeks. We had quiet dinners in my tiny kitchen where we'd sit close enough for our knees to brush under the table and had lengthy conversations. I took a breath, feeling the weight of my decisions settle on me. "I think I've been ready for a while," I admitted, my voice shaking slightly, but it was the truth. We tried to keep things professional at the bookstore, but it was impossible to ignore the way his hand would linger on mine or the way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. The age difference was always there, hanging in the background like an unspoken truth neither of us could ignore, and it wasn't that I cared what people thought, even though I knew others. That continued into the night as we told stories about our lives, his adventures in the city, my memories of John, and the life I believed I would always have. Would have their thoughts, but it was more about the feeling of time passing by quickly. Daniel was young, full of possibilities, and I was older, with a past I couldn't let go of. I was afraid that one day he would wake up and realize that I couldn't give him the future he deserved, but every time I brought it up, he would ignore my worries, bringing me close and kissing me until the doubts vanished, if only briefly, and it was simple to just be with him during those moments. Daniel became my routine. I would wake up anticipating his knock on the door, knowing that we would spend the day together in the bookstore sharing stories, laughing, and working side by side. It was a simple rhythm, but it was the first time in years that I felt alive again. I kept thinking the guilt would come, that it would hit me like a tidal wave overwhelming me with regret, but it never did. Instead, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. We danced around it, careful not to make anything too obvious, and saved our kisses for the quiet moments. The town was small and people talked, so we kept things quiet for the most part. I wasn't naive. I knew that an older woman getting close to a younger man would raise eyebrows, especially in a place like this where everyone knew each other's business, but somehow it felt too delicate to expose to the world just yet. One afternoon after we had just finished restocking the store, I was sitting on the old couch tucked away in the corner, drinking tea and thumbing through a doged copy of Weeing Heights. Daniel sat next to me, leaning back casually, his arms stretched along the back of the couch close enough for his fingers to graze my shoulder. After closing time, our touches were concealed behind the privacy of my kitchen or living room, but there were times when it was difficult to maintain that distance. "I don't think I've ever seen you without a book in your hand," he said, with a playful smile on his lips. I laughed quietly. "Well, this is a bookstore. I'd be out of business if I didn't love books." He turned to face me, his me brushing mine. "You really love it here, don't you?" I nodded. "I do. It's quiet here, and the books are like old friends. They've kept me company." His expression softened during some of the most trying times, and he looked at me in that way he occasionally did, as if he was trying to see past the layers I kept hidden from the outside world. I wondered what he saw when he looked at me, this older woman who had experienced more than he could probably imagine, and he asked abruptly, taking me by surprise. I scowled, not understanding what he meant, and I wondered why I would. He shrugged, shifting his gaze for a moment as if he was picking his words carefully. "I don't know, I suppose I just..." The question lingered in the air between us. "Do you ever want more than this town, this life?" I hadn't asked myself that question since John's death, and it seemed selfish to want more, but Daniel made me think, maybe there's still more out there for me. I finally said, placing the book on the coffee table. "This place has been my home for so long that I never imagined I'd need anything else." His eyes met mine again, and I saw. As much as I tried to ignore it, I knew what Daniel was really asking when he hinted at something more than the bookstore and a quiet routine we'd fallen into. I looked at him with my eyes wide open, and Ernest and I felt that familiar pull that had started so subtly but now tugged at me constantly. Something flickered there. Hope maybe, longing. What if you did? The question lingered about me like a warm blanket. The bell above the door jingled and we both jolted upright before I could respond, telling him that I wanted more and that perhaps I could see a life with him outside of this small shop. However, before I could do so, a customer wandered in, unaware of the tension that had filled the room. Daniel quickly offered to help the woman find what she was looking for, and I used the distraction to catch my breath. As the days went by, I found myself thinking more and more about Daniel's question. Could there something more for me and us? I wasn't young anymore, and every morning when I woke up, my body reminded me of that. My joints were stiff, and my skin didn't fit as well as it used to, but with Daniel I didn't feel old. Instead, I felt alive, as if I still had something to offer and something to experience. However, the fact that we were older than each other weighed heavily on me. It wasn't just the glances we received from others or the hushed remarks. I imagined it was more than that. What kind? As our relationship grew stronger, it became more difficult to deny how much I cared for him and how much he cared for me. However, the doubt and uncertainty persisted. One night after we closed the shop, Daniel invited me out to dinner. It was nothing special, just a small seafood restaurant by the harbor, but it felt like a big deal. I had already experienced a lot of marriage death loss, so could I really ask him to carry that weight with me? Would he even want to? We walked along the beach, the cool breeze tucking my hair and the sound of the waves filling the silence between us, and then we stopped at a small outcropping of rocks. The moonlight cast a soft glow over the water, and I could feel Daniel watching me, waiting for me to say something, but I was at a loss for words. "Why are you so quiet tonight?" he finally asked in a gentle voice, and I turned to face him, smiling weakly, just thinking about what I... He hesitated, then took a deep breath, and then he looked at me with that same quiet intensity and asked, "What have you decided?" "I don't know, I admitted in a voice that was barely more than a whisper. I care about you, Daniel, more than I ever expected to. But this I gestured between us. And it scares me why his voice was steady, but I could see the vulnerability in his eyes, the fear that maybe I'd pull away because I'm not young. Daniel took a step closer, his hand reaching for mine. You have more than you think, he said softly. And I don't care about any of that, I care about you. His words made me realize that perhaps I didn't need to have all the answers, that perhaps it was okay to just feel to let myself be happy again, even if it wasn't perfect, and that there were still doubts. I squeezed his hand, letting him know that I was the woman I used to be. Pull me closer. The sound of the ocean surrounded us, but all I could hear was the steady beat of my own heart. For the first time in a long time, it felt full, and perhaps there was more for us after all. In the days that followed, everything between us seemed to fall into a new, more intimate rhythm. The bookstore's subtle touches became bolder, with his hand finding mine as we passed each other, and his body brushing against me as we worked in the narrow aisles. We were careful not to attract attention, but the energy between us was. I was 52 years old, but when I was with Daniel, I didn't feel it. I felt like a woman again, not just a widow stuck in the past. The loneliness that had encircled me for so long was beginning to loosen its hold, and one evening as we were together, I couldn't stop thinking about him and the way he looked at me like I was the only person in the world that mattered. I would relive our times together in my head, the soft way he kissed me, and the feel of his skin against mine. This walk along the beach after closing had become our thing. It gave us time away from the shop from the town's eyes. Daniel had finished organizing a stack of books, and when he turned toward me, I saw that familiar look in his eyes that made my heart race. Do you want to go for a walk? He asked, his voice low as if he already knew what I would say. I nodded, slipping on my jacket. The shop was quiet, and the soft glow of the lamps cast long shadows on the walls. The evening was cool, with a gentle breeze pulling at the hem of my jacket as we headed down the well-known path to the shore. The moon was low in the sky, casting a silvery glow on the water, and we walked in comfortable silence while listening to the sound of the waves, our only company. Eventually, we stopped by a group of rocks where we usually sit, but tonight Daniel didn't sit down. Instead, he turned to me with a serious expression, as if he had something weighing on his. I've been thinking about us a lot. He began his speech steadily but with a quiet intensity. I swallowed, and my heartbeat quickened. What about us? He took a deep breath, running a hand through his hair. I don't want to hide any longer. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. He said that he wanted to tear down the walls that we had built around ourselves. Part of me wanted to say yes, to disregard caution and just say how I felt about him, but another part of me that was cautious. He stepped closer, his hand cupping my face and his thumb lightly brushing my cheek, saying, I don't care what people think. He said, softly, I care about you, I want to be with you, and I don't want to have to pretend otherwise. His words made my heart hurt in a way I hadn't anticipated. I wanted to believe him that it didn't matter what people thought, but the truth was that I had. I've lived long enough to understand how the world functions, and even though I was falling for Daniel more deeply than I ever imagined, I couldn't deny the reality of our situation. I care about you too, I whispered, leaning into his touch, but this is complicated. Daniel shook his head, his eyes searching mine. But it doesn't have to be, but it is. I insisted on taking a small step back, putting some distance between us. I've already lived a lifetime, Daniel. I've been married, I've lost someone I loved, and I don't want to hold you back. I didn't want to be the one who held him down and prevented him from living the life he deserved. I couldn't give him children, I couldn't promise him a future full of fewer possibilities. What if one day he realized that I'm not what you need? I said softly, feeling the weight of the words settle on my chest, and he stared at me. He frowned, his brow furrowing in frustration. Hold me back, you're not holding me back, you're everything I've been looking for. The sincerity in his voice almost broke me. His expression was unreadable for a long moment before he abruptly closed the distance between us, his hands firmly but gently gripping my shoulders. He said, I know what I want, and it's you, not some version of you that you think I deserve, just you. His voice was quiet but fierce, and his words left me speechless for a long time because I had convinced myself that I was no longer worthy of love and that my time had passed. But now I was standing here with Daniel's eyes locked. Before I could say anything, Daniel leaned in and kissed me tenderly and urgently, letting me forget all the doubts and fears that had been holding me back. I put my arms around his neck and kissed him back, letting myself forget, if only for a moment, all the doubts and fears that had been holding me back. When we finally parted ways, breathless, he rested his forehead against mine, his hands still holding me close, and he whispered, "Please." In that moment, something changed between us. It wasn't just about stolen kisses and quiet nights anymore. It was real, it was undeniable, and no matter how terrified I was, I couldn't deny that Daniel had become more than just a diversion from my loneliness. I closed my eyes and fought back the tears that threatened to spill over. No matter how scared I was, I couldn't deny that Daniel had become something I can't ignore. Didn't think I would ever have another chance at happiness. The following weeks were a blur. We stopped hiding and let people see us together. Of course, I could sense that people were watching us because every time we went somewhere together, like the grocery store, the women would give me those sidelong glances that said they were talking about me when I wasn't looking. And the men didn't bother to cover their smirks because they assumed they knew that this was an older woman having a liaison with a younger man, a joke. But they had no idea what it was like to have someone look at you the way Daniel looked at me, as if I were the only thing in the world, how my skin tingled when he touched me, or how my heart raced every time he kissed me. They had no idea of the late-night quiet conversations we had, or how we fit together so perfectly like two pieces of a puzzle that I hadn't even realized was missing. One night, as we lay tangled in, Daniel whispered, "I love you," and I froze, my heart skipping a beat. It was the first time either of us had said those words aloud, and although I had sensed it developing between us for weeks, hearing him say it was different. It was real, and I whispered back, my voice shaking with the weight of the confession. I did love him, despite the fear, the doubts, and everything. Perhaps that was enough, because everything began to fall apart more quickly than I had initially thought we could. It was a small town, after all, and everyone knew each other's business. The whispers, the knowing glances, and the judgment seemed to follow us everywhere we went. I had been naive enough to think that we could live in peace in our little world without anyone caring, but they did care, and once the rumors started, it felt like everything fell apart. I can still remember the first time I saw the looks in their eyes, the way the grocery store woman behind the counter refused to look at me, the way the men. I was standing in line at the bakery when a woman said, "Maybe you think he's her son." Her words hit me like a slap, but I just forced a smile and paid for my bread. The real stink came when the man behind me muttered, "Maybe she thinks he's her son." Daniel wasn't unaware either, as he'd always been the type to brush things off to laugh when people made condescending remarks. Outside the bar, we exchanged smug looks as we passed. We were trying to have a quiet lunch together one afternoon when I noticed the group of older men at the nearby table laughing louder than usual, their eyes on us as they snickered and whispered to each other, "What is it, date night with your mom?" One of them called out his voice across the cafe, but even he was unable to laugh off the ugliness that had begun to surround us. The gossip was cruel and had sharp teeth, and it sank into us in ways I hadn't anticipated. The other people burst out laughing, and their eyes were on Daniel, waiting for a response. I felt my heart tighten, so I reached for his hand beneath the table to try to ground myself, but I could feel him tense next to me. He didn't say anything, just got up suddenly, and his chair scraped the floor. Without saying anything, he left the cafe, leaving me sitting there feeling vulnerable and small. I tried to catch up with him, but he was pulling away, retreating into an area I couldn't reach. When he finally called the following day, his voice was distant, and I could hear the hesitation and struggle in his words. "We need to talk," he said, and I knew what was about to happen. We met at the beach, the same spot where everything had begun between us. The waves crashed against the shore, the salt air thick with the impending storm. Daniel. That night, he didn't come by the house, so I sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the empty chair across from me. The darkness felt oppressive. I wanted to argue with him to tell him that it didn't matter what people thought, that we could survive this if we just stayed strong. But the truth was that I'd been feeling it too, the weight of the town's judgment, the way it chipped away at us little by little. He stood with his hands in his pockets, his eyes fixed on the horizon. I walked up to him, my heart pounding in my chest, and he said quietly, his voice strained. "I don't think I can do this anymore," he said, his voice strained. I felt my heart break in that moment, not because I didn't understand, but because I did, and I knew how much this had cost him, how much it had cost us both. Today, standing here with the man I loved, I realized that love wasn't always enough. Sometimes the world just got in the way. He turned to me, and I whispered, my throat tight with emotion, and his eyes filled with sadness. "I love you," he said, and I believe him, but I don't think I'm strong enough for this. The days that followed felt like a blur. I went through the motions, opening the bookstore, stocking the shelves, and smiling at customers who offered their thinly veiled sympathy. I told myself that I was okay and didn't need anyone's pity, but at night, when I closed the shop and returned to my empty house, the silence was deafening. I would lie in bed and stare at the ceiling, wondering if I had made a mistake or if I could have fought harder. Have kept him, or had I known all along that this was going to happen? The town moved on, as towns do, and new scandals replaced the gossip about Daniel and me. People stopped whispering and giving me pathetic looks when I went into the grocery store, but the loneliness remained a constant reminder of what I had lost. I think about him every day, remembering how he smiled and made me feel alive again. I wonder if he thinks about me now, wherever he is, and if he misses me. But now that I'm alone again with only my memories to keep me company, I'm wondering what I should have done differently. Was it wrong to let him go? Should I have fought harder? Or was it inevitable that we'd end up like this? There are nights when the silence is too much to handle, so I sit by the window and look out at the dark sea. Sometimes I wish I could go back in time and wish I could have made it work, could have found a way to hold on to him without letting the world tear us apart. What would you have done if you were in my position? Would you have let him go, or would you have risked everything to hold on to love no matter the cost? Right now, all I have are these questions, and no matter how hard I try, I can't seem to find the answers on my own. Two people from different worlds torn apart by the weight of everyone else's opinions. Perhaps I'm just asking because I don't have the answers, or perhaps I'm hoping someone else does.